Billings, Montana, the autumn of 1954. A Thursday morning in the livestock auction barn on the south side of the Yellowstone River, 2 miles from the stockyards that had been the center of Billings commerce since the cattle drives of the 1880s, turned this particular bend in the river into the place where the beef of eastern Montana passed through on its way to the rest of the country. The barn was a large corrugated steel structure with a dirt floor in the holding pens and a concrete floor in the auction ring, and wooden bleacher seating that rose in 5 tiers around 3 sides of the ring. It smelled the way auction barns smell, which is the accumulated smell of cattle and sawdust, and the specific combination of diesel and manure that soaks into the wood and concrete of a working livestock facility over decades of use, and becomes, after long enough, simply the smell of the place, rather than the smell of any particular thing. The barn had been operating since 1931 and had seen, in those 23 years, the full range of what cattle auctions produce. From the drought years of the 1930s, when the cattle that came through the ring were thin, and the bids were low, and the men in the bleachers had the specific expression of people doing the best they could with a situation that had not asked their permission before arriving. Through the war years, when the beef prices had recovered and the ranchers had some breathing room, and into the post-war period when the economy had been good long enough that the men in the bleachers were wearing their good hats again. The auction barn was, in this way, a reliable gauge of the agricultural weather, and the people who came to it regularly could read it the way experienced ranchers read actual weather, which was with the specific accumulated knowledge of people who had been paying attention for a long time, which is a complete cross-section of the agricultural economy of eastern Montana, rendered visible in a single morning. The ranchers and the buyers and the commission agents and the bank representatives and the haulers and the curious townspeople who came to watch without any intention of bidding, because watching a cattle auction in 1954 was one of the things you could do in Billings on a Thursday morning that cost nothing and told you something true about the place you lived. On this particular Thursday, there were 120 people in the bleachers by 9 o'clock. The auction was scheduled to begin at 9:30. The cattle in the holding pens had been checked in beginning at 7. Among the lots checked in that morning was a herd of 41 Hereford cows and 1 bull, lot number 14, belonging to a ranch called the Harlan Place, which was 11,000 acres of grazing land in the Musselshell River Valley, 2 hours east of Billings, that had been in the same family since 1898, and that was being auctioned today because the woman who owned it could no longer run it alone and had run out of options that did not involve the auction. Her name was Ruth Harlan. She was 56 years old. She was sitting in the 3rd row of the bleachers on the east side of the ring, wearing a plain dark coat over a dress she had worn to church on Sundays for 6 years, and flat shoes that had not been bought for sitting in an auction barn, but that were what she had. She was sitting alone. Her son had died in Korea 2 years earlier, in the specific way that sons died in Korea in 1952, which was without warning, and with the specific bureaucratic formality of a telegram that arrived on a Tuesday and changed the shape of everything that came after. She had been running the ranch alone since then, with the help of 2 hired hands whose names were Carl Evers and Pete Strand, men who had worked the Harlan place for 7 and 11 years respectively, and who had stayed not because they had nowhere else to go, but because they were the kind of men who, when someone they respected was in a difficult situation, did not find it easy to leave. They had taken reduced wages without being asked. Carl in November of 1952, and Pete in the following January, each of them telling her separately that the wages could wait until things improved, in the specific way that serious men offer serious help, which is by making it a practical arrangement rather than a gesture. She had been running the ranch alone since then, who had stayed out of loyalty rather than for the wages she could afford to pay them. And she had run it well enough that the cattle she had brought in today were healthy animals that would bring a fair price. The fair price was not going to be enough. She had known this for several months, in the specific way that people who manage the finances of a working ranch know things that cannot yet be spoken aloud, because speaking them aloud makes them more real than the managing of them allows. The ranch had a loan against it with the Yellowstone County Bank, taken out in 1948 to put in a new well and repair the north pasture fence, and the loan had been manageable until it was not. And the point at which it had stopped being manageable was the point at which her son had died, and the two hired hands had taken reduced wages, and she had been running 11,000 acres with insufficient labor at the specific moment when the beef market had softened enough to make the math not work, regardless of how carefully she managed it. She was at the auction to sell the cattle. The money from the cattle was not going to cover the loan balance. She had discussed this with the bank officer, a man named Gerald Putnam, who was also in the barn that morning, sitting 4 rows above her and to the left, with a clipboard and the expression of a man who has a job to do and has made his peace with doing it. The man who came in through the south entrance at 9:15 was not from Billings. He was not from Montana. He had driven up from Sheridan, Wyoming the previous day in a car he had rented in Denver and had spent the night at the Northern Hotel on Broadway and had woken early and eaten breakfast in the hotel dining room and had driven to the auction barn because someone at the hotel had mentioned, when he asked what went on in Billings on a Thursday morning, that there was a cattle auction at the livestock barn south of the river, and that it was worth seeing if you had never seen one. He was 47 years old. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall and 245 pounds, and he was wearing a canvas ranching jacket over a plain shirt and dark work trousers, and a hat that was not a costume hat, but the kind that men who work outdoors in the northern plains wear, because the brim keeps the wind off and for no other reason. He paid the $2 admission at the door and found a seat in the upper bleachers on the west side of the ring in the back row, away from the main body of the crowd. He sat with his hat on his knees and watched the barn fill up around him. By 9:25, when the auctioneer was doing his microphone check and the commission agents were reviewing their papers, the man in the back row of the west bleachers had been watching the barn for 10 minutes with the specific comprehensive attention he brought to rooms he had not been in before. He saw Ruth Harlan because she was the only person in the barn who was sitting alone in the way that people sit alone when they are managing something difficult by being very still. There is a specific quality to the stillness of a person who is managing something difficult in a public place, something different from the ordinary stillness of a person who is simply waiting or thinking. It is the stillness of someone who has decided that movement would use energy they need for the managing, and that the managing requires all of it. Every other person in the bleachers was talking to someone, leaning over to make a comment, adjusting their bidding number, reviewing the lot descriptions in the program. She was sitting with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the empty auction ring with the specific fixed attention of someone who has arrived at a situation after a long time of traveling toward it and is now in it and is not looking away. He watched her for several minutes. He looked at the lot program he had been given at the door. He found Lot 14. He read the description. He looked at Gerald Putnam 4 rows above her and to the left with his clipboard. He read the program again. He looked at the holding pens visible through the gate at the far end of the barn, where the Hereford cattle were waiting. He sat in the back row of the west bleachers for the full 30 minutes between his arrival and the start of the auction, and did not speak to anyone, and did not move. The auction began at 9:32, 2 minutes behind schedule, because one of the commission agents had a question about the paperwork on Lot 7 that required a brief conversation between the auctioneer and the agent and the owner of Lot 7, a rancher from Roundup named Henry Birch, who had brought in 23 steers, and who settled the paperwork question in the direct way of a man who has been to this auction 11 times and understands that paperwork questions are settled by producing the relevant document and pointing to the relevant line. The first 13 lots moved through the ring in the brisk, efficient way that auction lots move when the auctioneer is experienced and the buyers know what they want. By 10:40, Lot 14 was called. The gate opened and the Harlan cattle came into the ring. 41 Herefords and 1 bull. Healthy animals that moved well and showed the care they had been raised with. The auctioneer described the lot. The bidding opened at $12 a head and moved quickly to $16 and then slowed. At $16.50, the room was down to 2 bidders. At $17, one of them dropped out. The remaining bidder, a cattle buyer from Great Falls named Douglas Crane, who had been coming to this barn for 11 years and knew good Herefords when he saw them, held at 17. The auctioneer called for further bids. The room was quiet. Ruth Harlan was looking at the ring. Gerald Putnam had his pen out. At $17 a head, 42 head, the total was $714, which was $237 short of what she needed it to be. She knew this. Gerald Putnam knew this. The auctioneer called once more. The voice came from the back row of the west bleachers. It said, 19. The room turned. The man in the back row of the west bleachers was holding his bidding number, which was number 81, at shoulder height. Douglas Crane from Great Falls looked at the man in the back row. He looked at the Herefords in the ring. He looked at his notes. $19 a head was the ceiling he had put on this lot before the morning began. He shook his head slightly. The auctioneer confirmed the bid. $19, 42 head, $798. Ruth Harlan was looking at the back row of the west bleachers. The man in the back row had lowered his number and put his hat back on, and was looking at the ring with the same still attention he had been giving it since the cattle came in. The auctioneer sold Lot 14 to bidder 81 at $19 a head. After the auction concluded, the payment process was handled at the commission desk near the south entrance. The man with bidding number 81 paid in cash, which was not unusual at a livestock auction in 1954. Where cash was still the common instrument of significant transactions. He paid what was owed for 42 head at $19 a head, in cash that he counted from a wallet that contained more of it than the transaction required, which was the specific kind of wallet that belongs to a man who travels with cash, because he has learned that cash is the instrument that closes transactions without the delays that checks introduce. He paid what was owed for 42 head at $19 a head, and he arranged for the cattle to be held in the barn's overnight pens. and he arranged for the cattle to be held in the barn's overnight pens until a hauler he had spoken to that morning could collect them and take them to a ranch near Sheridan, Wyoming, that he had told the commission agent was where they were going. When he had finished at the commission desk, he walked to the area where the sellers were collecting their payments. Ruth Harlan was at the window. The settlement she received was $798, which was $61 more than she had needed it to be, which meant that after the bank received what it was owed, she would have $61 left, which was the first time in 14 months that any transaction had left her with anything remaining. She took the settlement envelope. She turned from the window. The man with bidding number 81 was standing several feet away, putting his bidding card in his jacket pocket. She looked at him. He looked at her. He touched the brim of his hat. She said that she supposed she should thank him. He said that he had been looking for good Herefords and had found them, and that the thanks went the other way. He said it in the flat, certain tone of a man stating a transaction that had satisfied him. She looked at him for a moment. She said his name. He said yes. He said that the cattle would be well looked after. He said it the way you say something when you want a person to know a specific thing, and that specific thing is the thing you have just said. Then he walked to the south entrance and went through it and was gone. Ruth Harlan stood in the barn with the settlement envelope for a moment. The morning continued around her, the other sellers collecting their payments, the commission agents closing their books, the auctioneer having a coffee at the desk. She walked to the north exit and went out into the Thursday morning. The Yellowstone River was visible from the parking area, running south in the flat October light, moving the way rivers move in October when the snowmelt is done and the water is low and clear, and going where it was always going. She drove back to the Musselshell River Valley on roads she had driven for 30 years. The Harlan place was there when she arrived, 11,000 acres of it, the same as it had always been. She put the settlement envelope in the desk drawer in the kitchen. The $61 stayed in the drawer for a long time. She told the story of the auction to her sister when her sister visited at Christmas that year. Sitting at the kitchen table in the Harlan place with the coffee on and the snow coming down outside the window that looked west toward the Musselshell. Her sister listened to all of it without interrupting. When she had finished, her sister sat quietly for a moment and then asked if she was certain about who had bid on the cattle. She said she was. She said that she had looked at him for long enough to be certain, and that he had said yes when she said his name, and that she was not a woman who was uncertain about the things she was certain about. Her sister said that she should write him a letter. She said that she had thought about it, and had decided that the letter would have required him to receive something he had already declined to receive at the commission desk, which was her gratitude, and that declining it at the desk had been its own kind of message, and that the right response to that message was to understand it and to pass it on in whatever form the next occasion required. Her sister said that she should write him a letter. She said that she had thought about it and had decided that the letter would have required him to receive something he had already declined to receive at the commission desk, which was her gratitude, and that declining it at the desk had been its own kind of message, and that the right response to that message was to understand it and to pass it on in whatever form the next occasion required.